Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I had a couple of issues with the recording this week. So in the middle of this video, you're going to see this shirt again, or maybe more specifically, there's a couple of wardrobe changes. Let's call it make it a fancy feature here. The camera I'm using to record this deleted half of the video, so I've recorded it on two separate days. It's still all here, but I just wanted to let you know that you're not seeing things, you're not imagining things. I had a couple of issues, and rather than re-record everything, I've kind of chopped and glued things back together so that it works. Secondly, we're going to be taking a bit of a break for the summer, so July and August. There have been some, with our COVID situation, there's been some financial issues here at the church, and so many of our staff have been laid off for the time being. They are temporary layoffs. The plan is that we will be back in full swing in September, but we will miss you over the next few weeks, couple months. But we will be back again, both hopefully in person and on YouTube. So thank you, and I will now throw to yesterday me with a different wardrobe. Thanks for joining us. We're in the last week of our series on a guy in the Bible named Joseph, and it's called Big Picture. Why is it called that? Well, Joseph had a lot of wild, weird, and unbelievable things happen to him, good and bad. But all along, God was working towards the bigger picture in his life. The bigger picture Joseph just couldn't see. Now, before we get into the last part of Joseph's story, let me ask you a question. Have you ever tried to get payback on someone? Maybe a younger sibling who stole your favorite sweater without asking, or a friend who spread a rumor about you. We all have our own story of payback, big or small. We all have the story. How do I know? Because in big or small ways, we've all been wronged. We've all been hurt. We've all been frustrated. We've all had someone do something to us, or say something about us, or treat us in a way that makes us want one thing and one thing only: payback. We want the other person to experience the same amount of pain or frustration or embarrassment that we experienced because of them. And here's the thing, we all have the power to get payback. Now, don't move on without continuing to the rest of the lesson, because that's not the point. We not only have the potential to want payback, we have the power to actually do it. And sometimes that payback is public. We do something directly and openly to a person who wronged us. Maybe that's confronting them in the hallway with a big fight, or tagging them in a really nasty social media post, or doing something to embarrass them in front of someone else. That kind of payback isn't hard to recognize. It's out there for the world to see, and that's the way we want it. Sometimes payback is more passive, meaning it's a little less obvious and a little more behind the other person's back. Maybe that's spreading a rumor about them, or moving seats at a lunch table, or just rolling your eyes when they walk away. Though the other person may not recognize it or feel it, the consequences still happen. You're still getting payback. You're just looking for it in a more subtle way. Or maybe for you, the payback is just in your head. You haven't actually taken a step to get the payback, either publicly or passively, but you think about it all the time. You're constantly setting up scenarios in your mind of how you would get the payback you want. And even though you may not actually take the steps to make it happen, it still consumes you. Now listen, I know this all sounds really harsh, but we're friends here, right? So can we just be honest with each other and admit that we've all felt that way a time or two? There's something about payback that just feels fair to us. But just because payback feels fair doesn't mean it is. It doesn't mean that it's best for us. In fact, I think there's a better approach we could all take if we put down our power to pay back. Now, if there was anyone who had reason for wanting payback, it was Joseph. His story is full, and I mean full, of people betraying him, lying about him, and causing him years and years of pain and suffering that he just didn't deserve. To give you a quick recap, Joseph was one of a dozen sons, but his father Jacob loved him the most. Talk about some awkward family dynamics. Because of that, his brothers got so mad that they threw him in a well and eventually sold him into slavery, where he ended up in Egypt. Then, when he was actually doing a good job where he was working to get a promotion in the house of this guy named Potiphar, Potiphar's wife makes a move on Joseph, and when Joseph turned her down, he ends up in prison. And there he stayed for several years before finally getting released and promoted to work for the Pharaoh. And that's a lot, right? Now, if I put myself in Joseph's sandals for a minute, I can tell you what I'd be thinking about during all those years of slavery and separation from my family and imprisonment. I'd probably be thinking of little else than the best way to get back at everyone who wronged me. Wouldn't you? So, let's pick Joseph's story back up and find out exactly what he did. At this point, Joseph was doing much better. He had not only been released from prison, he had been elevated to second in command over all of Egypt. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the distribution of food throughout the entire Egyptian empire, and that was a big deal, because this was during a period of time where an intense famine had come into the land of Egypt and the whole world surrounding Egypt. And this famine or shortage of food was so bad that people from far away started making the journey to Egypt to find food so that they wouldn't starve. And Joseph was the guy they were coming to for help. Now, of all the people in the world, guess who showed up one day to ask Joseph for food? None other than his brothers, the very same guys who sold him into slavery years ago. Well, Joseph immediately recognized his brothers. They didn't realize who they were speaking to. It had been so long since they'd seen him that they may have even assumed that he was dead. And if they didn't, they certainly didn't imagine the brother they turned into a slave would be the man with so much power in Egypt. And yet there stood Joseph in a position of complete power over his brothers. And they all needed his help. They all needed him to save their lives. And in that moment, he had the power to pay back all the wrongs they'd committed. This was the moment that Joseph could have been dreaming of. The moment when payback would finally be his. But take a look at what happened next. In Genesis 45, verses 1 to 5, and then 10 to 11. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please, come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your households, and all your animals will starve." Joseph could have literally done anything he wanted to his brothers. He could have paid them back 1,000,000 times over for what they'd done to him. He could have let them starve, or snapped his fingers and had them thrown into prison, or even killed. That's how much power he had over them. But instead, Joseph took a different path. He chose forgiveness. I mean, how amazing is that? Can you imagine how surprised Joseph's brothers must have been? One minute they found out their brother Joseph was alive, and then in the next he was embracing them rather than giving them what they deserved. Here's what I think we can learn from this part of Joseph's story. And that is, when you can't see the bigger picture, like most of us can't on a day-to-day basis, choose to forgive. Joseph's response to his brothers gives us a powerful example of how God wants us all to deal with the people who wrong us. We may never know why they did what they did. They may never apologize for the hurt or embarrassment they caused us. There are details of the bigger picture that we'll never see or understand, but we still have the choice. We can choose forgiveness or payback. We have the power to choose. Think of it this way. If you're in a relationship with another person, a parent, a friend, a sibling, a boyfriend or girlfriend, anyone, there's something that connects the two of you. There's a bridge. But when someone wrongs or hurts you, that bridge is suddenly broken. It becomes shaky and the connection between the two of you is damaged. Then you're left with a choice. You can either burn the bridge, breaking it down completely by paying back wrong for wrong and hurt for hurt, or you can build the bridge, reestablishing your connection with things like forgiveness, grace, and peace. Of course, I'm not saying you just keep rebuilding bridges with people who have hurt you deeply and repeatedly. Sometimes the best way to actually choose forgiveness is to set some healthy boundaries and talk about the wrong things done to you with someone who can help you. But when it's possible, it's our job to lay down our right to pay back and instead choose forgiveness. Joseph could have made the choice to prove a point. He could have fought to be right. He could have chosen not to help his brothers and burned that bridge between them. But instead, he chose to forgive them. And that changed everything. When you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. I'm sure some of you are hearing this and thinking, it sounds nice, but how can someone actually do that? How can you choose forgiveness instead of payback? That's a really fair question, because honestly, this is really hard stuff. It's hard to choose to be the bridge builder rather than the bridge burner. And what can make it even harder is when we can't see the bigger picture. When we don't know all the details or the full story about the situation we're in. So how do we start? I have 3 things for you. First, start small. Practice extending things like grace, forgiveness, and peace to others in small ways. Secondly, forgive first. Think about your own life for a second. Who has wronged you recently? You don't need to wait for them to apologize to forgive. Thirdly, pursue forgiveness. We can't always control the way people treat us, but we can control the way we treat them in response. We can pursue forgiveness. Of course, forgiveness is not always easy, but the good news is we have a God who is the best at forgiving. He's forgiven each and every one of us, and he wants to help us do the same for others. And when we ask for his help forgiving someone else, he will always give it. Today, maybe that's where you need to start. Ask God to help you forgive someone who has wronged you, so that you can start building a bridge towards forgiveness rather than payback. And remember, even and especially when you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive.